The letter to the Romans has probably had more influence on church history than any other book. If I can just give you an example, Augustine came to faith through Romans. Martin Luther made his great discovery through Romans. Karl Barth, one of the great theologians of the 20th century, he started his theological program by doing a commentary on Romans. So it's had incredible influence. Yeah, well, Paul's letter to the Romans you can find after the Acts of the Apostles, and it's 16 chapters long. And Paul wrote this letter to the Christians in Rome between around about 55 and 57 AD. Well, the special thing about Romans, in a way, that it's Paul's last will and testament. So I actually think it's his last letter. Some people put other letters later on, but I think it's probably his last letter. So it has got this objective flavour. Nevertheless, Paul was still addressing problems in the church in Rome.
Why is Paul's letter where it is if it's the last one he wrote?
Well, when they were forming a list of Paul's letters, and the technical term for that list is canon, they put them roughly in order of descending length. So Romans is long, so that's put first. It's just such a fantastic letter. It answers just about everything. Not everything, but just about everything. So it talks about things like sin, it talks about how you can be saved, it even talks about things, your relationship to the state, how we should love one another. It covers just about everything.
You're not a bit biased here?
I'm a bit biased because I've actually written on Romans, yes.
Okay, so if I was in Caesarea and I needed to come and pay my taxes, this is where I'd come. We're in a sort of tax office type complex. And on the floor there's this mosaic, and it actually uses a bit of biblical wisdom to encourage the people here to pay their taxes. So let me first tell you that in Romans 13 verse 1, there's a famous part of the Bible that's been much disputed. It says this: "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." So that's what Paul says. In other words, obey the authorities there. And in this mosaic, this is being given, or sort of paraphrased, as advice for people to pay their taxes. So here it says something along the lines of, the one who does not want to fear, or does not wish to fear the authorities, do good, and he will have for himself a reward. So in other words, pay up. So the mosaic runs something like this: Hotheles mephobes thai ten exousian to agathon poie kai exaiapainon exaltes.
That's what I thought, yeah.
Yeah.
And I've tried to calculate the number of commentaries, and I reckon they're getting on for 1,000 commentaries on Romans. This is, I think, one of the best commentaries on Romans, Heinrich Schleyer. This is by somebody called Charles Cranfield. So you've got volume 1, takes you from chapters 1 through to chapter 8. Volume 2 takes you from 9 through to 16. And if you want a 3-volume commentary, do you want a 3-volume commentary?
I do.
This is a 3-volume commentary. This is a German scholar called Ulrich Wilkins. I mean, I've got this like modest collection, but on Romans, the commentaries start round about here, and they go down there, and they finish round about here. And then I've got other commentaries on Romans, interspersed.
Is he the guy you'd have at a dinner party when someone says, "Who would you have as your ultimate dinner party?"
I'm not sure about that, because he could get pretty angry, and I don't think he'd be like an easy person to have around. No. Now, one of the striking things about Romans is that Paul talks about a lot of things which are actually quite alien to our thinking. So, for example, he talks quite a lot about sin, but he doesn't talk about sins in the plural. He talks about sin in the singular. And he sees sin almost like some mythological entity, as some monster. And so when he talks about sin, he's not so much thinking about individual things like stealing, lying, committing adultery or whatever, but he's thinking about this power that overcomes the human person. And there's a very striking verse actually in chapter 3, verse 9, where he says that everyone is under the power of sin. This is from Romans 3, verse 20. Paul says, no human being will be justified in his sight by works of law. And so it's absolutely clear. In fact, this goes so much against a lot of current religious thinking, this idea that you're saved by good works, like a Boy Scout religion, so to speak.
So how does one become justified according to Paul?
Well, for Paul, you can only be justified through the mercy of God. And this mercy of God is shown exclusively in Jesus Christ. And so what Paul is saying is that if somebody is in the law court before God his judge, if he or she has faith in Christ, God gives the verdict not guilty. We know in Rome at this time there's a lot of anti-Semitism, sort of hatred of the Jewish people. And you'd find this both amongst the pagans, the non-Christians, and possibly amongst the Christians as well. And so when Paul comes to Romans 9 to 11, he emphasizes the priority of Israel in God's plan of salvation. And so it may be that this is one of the purposes of the letter. In chapter 1, verses 16 to 17, he talks about the gospel, which means the good news, being the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith. And then this is striking. He says, to the Jew first, and to the Greek, i.e. the Gentile. So for Paul, Israel still has this priority. I mean, some of the stuff in Romans 9 to 11 is, I think, explosive. Because what he's doing is addressing a very difficult problem. God made all these promises to Israel in the Old Testament. And yet, as Paul writes the letter to the Romans in the mid-first century, the vast majority of Jews had not accepted Christ or Jesus as their Messiah. They had not accepted Jesus as their Messiah. And so he struggles with this problem for 3 chapters. But then towards the end of this section, he then says something I think quite remarkable. He says it was God's purpose that the Jews would not believe in Jesus. And he says that that was in God's purpose because Israel was hardened, their heart was hardened in order that salvation passes to the Gentiles. And then he says, addressing the Gentiles, he said, you have to understand that a point is going to come when this hardening of Israel is going to come to an end. And it comes to an end, essentially, at the second coming of Christ. So Paul had this idea that Christ would come again to judge, as they say in the Creed, judge the living and the dead, and so on. And he says in Romans 11:26, all Israel will be saved. Now, there are 1 or 2 Jews now who do believe in Christ, but it's a tiny, tiny percentage. And I imagine a lot of Jewish people would find that rather condescending if I say to them, you'll be all right, you'll be saved at the second coming. If I can just give a story, some years ago I had a Jewish colleague, and I used to say to him, don't worry, on the last day when Christ comes again, you will come to faith and you'll be saved. And he used to say back to me, don't worry, Richard, according to the rabbis, there were certain, righteous Gentiles, and you're probably one of those righteous Gentiles, so you're going to be all right as well. So I think a lot of Jewish people find this message rather condescending, frankly.